Howdy folks, I'm Ben Starr, the ultimate food geek. Welcome back to my kitchen. Today we are baking sourdough shortcake. And that means real shortcake. Now if you're the kind of person that thinks you take this thing from the grocery store and fill it with some strawberries and whipped cream, that strawberry shortcake magically happens, this ain't shortcake, folks. And this is more like sponge cake, but I don't think I would even honor this by calling it sponge cake. And sponge cakes and shortcakes are the complete opposite of each other. Also, you don't even want to read the ingredients list on the back of here. It doesn't sound anything like a sponge cake, much less a shortcake. True shortcakes come to us from Old England, when the word short meant brittle or crusty or crumbly. And so by calling a cake a shortcake, they meant it was a crusty, brittle cake. I didn't sound anything like a sponge cake, right? The truth is that shortcakes are much more like what we in America call biscuits than they are like what we in America call a cake. And you may be quite shocked to find that the method for making a shortcake is in fact basically the same method that we use to make a biscuit. Now back in the day, shortcakes were not leavened at all. They were very, very dense. This was before we had the invention of chemical leaveners like baking soda and baking powder. Nobody back then ever thought to put sourdough starter in the shortcake in order to leaven it naturally. So sourdough shortcake comes from the modern era of shortcake baking when we use a chemical leavener like baking powder in order to cause the shortcake to rise. The sourdough starter that we're adding to it is really just there for flavor. Technically, you would consider this to be a discard recipe, but those of you who follow me know that we never discard starter in my world, ever, ever, ever. We only feed our starter when we need to make more, even if that's only every few months, and we never discard. So the only time we put sourdough starter into a recipe is with intention, because we don't have sourdough discard coming out of our ears and trying to figure out some recipe just to cram it into. But in this case, the addition of sourdough starter to an old-fashioned shortcake actually makes it really, really good. So let's get started. We are weighing our ingredients today because the only way to ensure success and consistency when baking is by weight. If you are a beginner, get yourself a scale. It is the only way to ensure accuracy and precision when measuring. And today I'm actually speaking in ounces. For you metric folks, the conversions are going to be right there on the screen. And also the full written recipe is in the video description. If you click underneath this video where it says more, the entire written recipe is there in both ounces and grams, as well as a link to my website, ultimatefoodgeek.com, where you can print out the recipe for free. So we are starting with 8 ounces of sourdough starter, cold, unfed, straight from the fridge, and this starter is at 100% hydration. This means when you feed it, you are feeding it equal weights of flour and water, not equal volumes. If you feed your starter with a cup of flour and a cup of water, you are not at 100% hydration, and this recipe is going to fail. If you feed your starter, for example, 4 ounces of flour and 4 ounces of water, you're at 100% hydration. You're feeding the exact same weights. And when you take your lid off, if you've got hooch there, you want to stir it back in. You never pour hooch off of your starter, ever. Don't ever do that. It screws up your hydration. All right, we are using 8 ounces of this sourdough starter. To our starter, we are adding 4 ounces of buttermilk, real buttermilk. If you are one of those creeps that's like, oh, I just make my buttermilk by adding a little bit of vinegar to regular milk. You're not making buttermilk, you're making vinegary milk, and that's disgusting. Go buy real buttermilk. My followers know how important this is, and real buttermilk is amazing, you guys. It lasts way beyond the expiration date, and when you get low and need to make more, you just refill the container with regular fresh milk, leave it on the countertop for a couple of days, and it turns itself into buttermilk. It's amazing. Buttermilk is an absolute necessity when baking. Use it. All right. Now, we are going to incorporate this starter with the buttermilk to sort of thin it out. And you can do this with a number of different kitchen tools, but my favorite is this little gravy whisk. It's a little flat whisk, sits flat on the bottom of the bowl, and it really does a good job of breaking starter up and getting it incorporated with other liquid ingredients. This takes just a little while. Be patient. Don't be super aggressive, or it's going to splash all over you. And now for our final ingredients. 1 egg, straight from my chickens. 4 ounces of brown sugar, either light or dark will work. And folks, if you don't have brown sugar, you can just use regular sugar. I just like the increased flavor that brown sugar gives to a product. And finally, about a tablespoon of good quality vanilla extract. I don't measure this, I just eyeball it. And now we're gonna get those incorporated nice and smooth. Now, in a separate bowl, we are going to mix up our dry ingredients. And that consists of 6 ounces of all-purpose flour. Do not use bread flour with this recipe, you guys. You'll end up with a tough cake, and nobody likes tough cake. We're going to add about a teaspoon of coarse salt or half a teaspoon of fine or table salt. I actually eyeball this rather than measuring or weighing because it's not that important in this recipe. And finally, a tablespoon of baking powder, not baking soda. They are not interchangeable. And if you don't use baking powder very often, make sure you check the expiration date on the container to make sure it's not expired. Expired baking powder isn't going to work as well, and you're going to end up with a really dense cake. Of course, the real old-fashioned shortcakes were all super dense because they had no leavening at all. So if that's the case, you can just say it's authentic old-fashioned shortcake. All right, we are going to get this stirred around with fingers here. And now we need to cut in our butter, or shortening. So shortcake is known as shortcake not only because short in Old English meant brittle or crumbly, but also this cake is made with a lot of fat that acts as shortening. As we know from baking sourdough bread, when water gets wet, 2 subproteins in the flour, gliadin and glutenin, begin to link together to create a longer chain called gluten. And this gluten structure is very important when we bake sourdough bread because it's what traps the carbon dioxide that's being produced by the yeast and allows that bread to rise when it goes into the oven. With a quick bread, like pretty much any kind of cake, we actively do not want to develop the gluten because then the cake will be chewy like bread, right? That's not what we want. Gluten is the enemy of a short bread. Enter stage right, fat, in the form of butter in this particular recipe. Fat globules interfere with that linking action that gluten wants to do once flour becomes hydrated. So it shortens the chains of gluten because it interferes with that bonding process, and thus our baked goods are more tender, like cakes or sandwich bread, which has added fats to it. The term shortening was used for any fat that was added to a baked good before the advent of hydrogenated fats like Crisco. Once those came on the scene, they were shelf-stable, solid fats, and there really aren't that many of those. It was a pretty novel idea, and they were referred to as shortenings. So now when somebody says shortening, you think, oh, artery-clogging hydrogenated fats! But any fat, liquid or solid, that is added to a baked product is referred to as shortening. Shortcakes rely on a pretty large amount of that fat to make them delicate, crumbly, and tender. So in this case, we are using 4 ounces of unsalted butter. We always bake with unsalted butter because you don't know how much salt is in salted butter. Salted butter's only purpose is to sit at room temperature on your countertop to be smeared on something that's about to go right into your mouth hole. Otherwise, when we bake, always unsalted butter. All right, there are multiple ways to incorporate this butter into our dry ingredients, but my favorite, easiest way is to use a box grater. If you do not have a box grater, you can use a pastry blender, you can get in there with 2 knives and crisscross them, or you can just get in there with your fingers and rub it in. But for me, the quickest and easiest way to do this is with a box grater. So I'm just gonna kind of toss the butter in the flour so that my fingers aren't melting right into the butter, and I'm gonna grate that right into the dry ingredients. Now, I usually toss my stick of butter into the freezer 5 minutes or so before I start this recipe, just to make sure it stays nice and solid as I'm grating. All right, once that's all done, we just need to make sure we toss that grated butter with the flour so that each one of those little shards of butter is fully coated with the flour. And now it's time to incorporate our wet ingredients into the dry ingredient. Now, I like to take a fork when I'm working with quick breads because we really want to be very gentle as we stir the liquid ingredients into the dry ingredients. The more we work that dough, the more gluten develops and the tougher the final product is going to be. So I like to basically just use a dragging motion to drag those dry ingredients through the wet ingredients, and we're going to continue to do this until we notice that no more dry flour is visible. You don't want to get in there and stir around very quickly because that stirring action really does tend to overdevelop the gluten. We can do some scraping motions along the bottom of the bowl just to make sure all of that liquid ingredient is incorporated. In terms of baking vessels, an 8 or 9-inch cake pan will do, but I really like to do this the old-fashioned way in a trusty cast iron skillet This is a number 6 Wagner skillet for those who are into antique cast iron like me, but a regular 8 or 9-inch cast iron skillet or cake pan will do. You just want to prepare it, and for some of you that's going to mean rubbing it with butter because you hate baking spray. That's perfectly fine. Baking spray works for me. You can also line yours with parchment if you want to waste money. That's totally fine with me. And now we're going to scrape our shortcake batter into the pan, even it out, but again, don't overwork it. And then I like to finish mine with a sprinkling of raw sugar crystals. This adds a really nice kind of crunchy texture to the top of the shortcake, but it's completely optional. You certainly do not have to do it. All right, this is going to go into the center of a preheated 400-degree oven for 25 to 30 minutes until it's completely solidified. Now, shortcakes were never meant to be a standalone cake that you eat by itself, like chocolate cake. They were always meant to be graced by some kind of fruit, usually. And of course, in the United States, strawberry shortcake is ubiquitous. But folks, the crappy strawberries that you get in the supermarket 365 days of the year are garbage. They come from hundreds or in some cases thousands of miles away. They're picked a week or 2 before they even turn red, gassed with ethylene to start the ripening process, and by the time we eat them, they're just disgusting. But it's all we know, right? Until you go to the farmer's market in June and you get those tiny, itty-bitty, beautiful blood red strawberries that are juicy all the way through, and they explode in your mouth and they fill you with this foreign and incredible sensation like something you've never tasted, something from another world. That's what strawberries, and in fact all fruit, are supposed to taste like in their season, grown close to where you live. But y'all, we have forgotten this concept of seasonality, and I know that it sounds like some hippie buzzword from Portlandia, but really, folks, if you can resist the temptation to buy this store-bought crap until strawberries are in season in your area, the difference is unbelievable. And then you better be sure there's a strawberry shortcake on your dinner table 3 or 4 nights a week for 3 weeks until strawberry season is over and they're no longer ripening in your area. Now, strawberry season starts around mid-May in Texas. It works its way a little bit later every few days until we get all the way up into Canada when strawberry season happens in July. But if you have never tasted a strawberry that was grown near you and picked while ripe, an heirloom variety that's not super hard and able to resist traveling in an 18-wheeler for 2,000 miles, the old-fashioned heirloom varieties that are tender and delicate, and once the farmer picks them, you gotta eat those within 48 hours or they just turn to mush, that is a real strawberry. But I will step off my pulpit and tell you how to make disgusting grocery store strawberries barely edible so that you can have strawberry shortcake in February. First of all, you wanna wash them, because there ain't no telling what they sprayed on them in the field or the greenhouse to keep the bugs from eating them. And then you want to slice them. The size that you slice them to is entirely up to you, but if you prefer smaller portions, once you've got a couple of slices off the tip of the strawberry, I like to cut straight down into the strawberry toward the stem and then finish slicing that way, and it just kind of falls into perfect slices in the bowl. When I was a kid, I was taught that the tops of strawberries are poisonous. That's completely not true. But they don't have the greatest texture. So it's better to throw the stems away or compost them, feed them to your pets. Once you have your strawberry slice, it is time to sweeten them. And my sweetener of choice for store-bought strawberries is brown sugar. It adds a nice kind of depth of sweetness that's a little bit more pleasant than white sugar. But you can certainly use white sugar if it's the only thing you have. The amount of sugar that you add entirely depends upon your own taste preference. I don't like to absolutely drown mine in sugar, but store-bought strawberries that come from Mexico or South America typically aren't very sweet at all, so they need at least a little bit of help. If you prefer a more natural sugar, drizzle a little bit of honey or maple syrup on top of them. Or if you're diabetic and you want to use an artificial sweetener, you can certainly do that too. I also like to add just a little bitty sprinkling of salt because a little bit of salt makes everything better. Now we're going to get these stirred to get the strawberries evenly tossed in that sugar. And now we want to let them sit on the countertop to macerate careful with that pronunciation, for at least an hour. And the sugar will draw the strawberries' natural juices out and help sort of make a dressing that's nice and sweet and flavorful that you can toss the strawberries in just before you put them onto the cake. It also gives you a little bit of that beautiful strawberry juice that you can spoon onto the cake to make it nice and moist. Now, strawberry shortcake is traditionally topped with whipped cream. And I'm not even going to indulge those of you who use Cool Whip, because if you use Cool Whip, you should be whipped. That is not cream. Look at the ingredients. The quickest acceptable way to whipped cream is to use the can, because it is mostly sugar and cream with a few binding agents and some propellant in it, but it's still not the best choice. However, whipping cream by hand or with the machine's a little bit messy. You want to do it right before you serve, and after you've had a nice big meal, the last thing you want to do is deal with whipping cream. So, there is a better way, my friends, and it involves sour cream. A fermented dairy product, just like buttermilk. It has a lot more flavor and is actually better for you than non-fermented dairy. And once you try this brown sugar sour cream on your strawberry shortcake, you will never go back, and it's easier. So what we're gonna do is just take some sour cream out of the container, however much you're gonna need to use. And then we're gonna add, again, brown sugar. Regular sugar will work, but this is much more delicious. And again, the amount of sugar that you add depends on how sweet you want your brown sugar cream to be. I don't really like my cream to be that super sweet, but you can go as hog wild as you want to based on your own dietary needs and palatary preferences. And again, of course, just the tiniest pinch of salt. And once you get that stirred, you want to let it sit for a couple of minutes, and the sugar crystals are going to dissolve and make like little brown splotches, and then all you got to do is stir it one more time to bring it all together. After 25 minutes, pull your shortcake out and give it a quick tap. And if it sinks in at the top and feels kind of soft, you'll know it's not done yet. You need to give it 5 to 10 more minutes. But in my case, 25 minutes at 400 degrees was perfect. And here we have it, old-fashioned shortcake. You would not believe how good this smells. Now, it needs to fully cool. This is not one of those cakes that you can serve warm. Actually, is there a cake that you can serve warm? Maybe chocolate lava cake. Shortcake needs to fully cool to allow its internal structure to properly set. So you're gonna wanna bake this a couple or 3 hours before you intend to serve it, if not the day before. I'll be back in a few hours to cut into this bad boy, top it properly, and give it a sample. Our cake has cooled. My dinner guests have actually already eaten several pieces of it, but we're gonna give it a quick taste. Definitely crumbly, as its namesake suggests. Wow. It is rich and buttery, incredibly moist. Far more moist than any sponge cake could ever claim to be. The brown sugar gives it a really lovely depth of flavor, and there's a nice crunch from that raw sugar that we put on top of it. This is really, really good cake. But, of course, now we gotta dress it up the proper way, right? I like to cut a nice wedge, then cut that wedge in half, and set those triangles sort of opposite each other. And then it's time to top with our macerated strawberries. And of course, folks, if you have access to real strawberries locally in season, they don't need any sugar at all. All you gotta do is slice them fresh right on top of this cake. That's when you're having true, proper strawberry shortcake. And of course, you see all of this delicious juice in the bowl. We want to spoon that all over the cake to saturate it. And then we're topping it with that incredible brown sugar cream. And folks, if it doesn't seem traditional to you that we're not using whipped cream, shortcakes were really popular in the days before the advent of refrigeration. So after folks would milk their cows, that milk would sit out at room temperature overnight to allow the cream to rise to the top. As that happened, the natural lactobacillus bacteria in the milk soured that cream and milk. And then the soured milk was either used to churn butter, which produced a cultured butter, the style that's still omnipresent in Europe today. Or if they were going to make whipped cream, they were making whipped cream with cultured or soured cream. So this brown sugar sour cream is actually a bit more authentic to the origins of strawberry shortcake than using regular whipped cream. Okay, now it's time to do the deed. Yo, the only thing that can make this better is if it were early June and I had fresh strawberries from my garden. That is exquisite, and that is what shortcake really is. So forget this crap, don't buy it, don't tolerate it if a restaurant tries to serve it to you. This is the real deal, folks. I hope you've learned something interesting from this little video. If you have, I would really appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button. I have so much more cool stuff headed your way over the next year or two. Please drop me a comment in the comments section below, especially if you're having a challenging time with this recipe. I try to get around to all of the comments from the folks that need help. Hit me up on my website, ultimatefoodgeek.com, for a free printable version of this recipe and tons more. Folks, I am Ben Starr, the Ultimate Food Geek. Thanks for watching.